So, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I'm pleased to welcome everyone to the final discussion panel of the International Conference PALE-2020. As far as you're already concerned, the key subject is psychology of inferiority. Overall, the discussion panel today is attended by scientists and experts from 3 countries: France, USA, and Ukraine. It's a great honor for me to moderate this discussion panel. So let me please introduce our speakers. Oleg Maltsev, Ukraine. Author, researcher, criminologist, psychologist, academician of Ukraine Academy of Sciences, founder and director of the Memory Institute, head of Expeditionary Corps. Dr. Maltsev is an author of numerous books in the areas such as applied history, sociology, depth psychology, philosophy, criminalistics, and criminology. Lucien Aulard-Bippe, France. Writer, lecturer, sociologist, political scientist, author of numerous scientific papers and books on French nihilism and neo-Leninism, radical Islamism, anti-Americanism, and anti-Semitism. Dr. Aulard-Bippe spent many years working together with French thinker Jean Baudrillard. Stephen Best, USA. Author, speaker, public intellectual. Professor at the University of Texas, El Paso. Dr. Best is an activist with 30 years' work in diverse social movements such as animal rights, human overpopulation, ecological crisis, terrorism, and mass media. Maxim Lepsky, Ukraine. Doctor of Philosophy, academician of Ukraine Academy of Sciences, head of Sociology and Management Department, Zaporizhia National University, Ukraine. And Professor Lepsky is a chairman of the Social Forecasting Research Committee of the Sociological Association of Ukraine. Vitaly Lunyov, Ukraine. Ph.D. in psychology, associate professor, academician of Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, member of the American Psychological Association, the American Academy of Clinical Psychology, World Federation for Mental Health, USA, and the European Academy of Natural Sciences, Germany. Alexander Sagaidak, Ukraine. Ph.D. in psychology, head of Theorem Association, Jungian analyst, hypnologist, academician in psychology, anthropology, sociology, chairman of the Psychological, Philosophical, Scientific Society at the UAS. And also one of the speakers is Professor Lyudmila Filipovich, Doctor of Philosophy, religious scholar, professor, head of the Department of Philosophy and History of Religion in Institute of Philosophy by Grigory Skovoroda, National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. I'm delighted to be here today, and let me please deliver a few words about the reference terms of this panel. So each speaker holds the opportunity to answer 3 questions formulated and presented to speakers in advance. Please limit your answers up to 7-8 minutes. And to begin with, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Maltsev. Let me mention the fact that Dr. Maltsev is the first scholar who has recognized the perspective of a scientific category such as psychology of inferiority. So please, Dr. Maltsev.
Окей, спасибо большое, что дали слово.
Thank you for giving me the floor.
И я взял на себя смелость пояснить вопросы, которые нам сегодня представлены на обсуждение.
So I feel obliged to clarify the subjects of our discussion that we are going to be speaking about today.
И первый вопрос – это ущербность как новая категория исследовательской психологической науки мировой.
And the first subject of our discussion is inferiority as a new category of world psychological science.
Я в течение 1 минуты постараюсь пояснить, о чем речь идет.
And in the course of 1 minute, I would like to briefly describe what is this about.
Дело в том, что сегодняшняя академическая психологическая наука как бы стоит на 3 китах.
So today's academic mainstream science is founded, is established on 3 main pillars.
Это Фрейд, Юнг и Леопольд Сонди.
And these main people are Freud, Leopold Sondy, and Gustav Jung.
То есть это 3 кита, на которых стоит как бы современная психологическая наука.
So these are 3 pillars that are in the foundation of modern science, psychological science.
И это как бы академическая наука, и каждое из этих направлений как бы глубинной психологии имеет свою категорию как бы исследования.
And in this academic science, every direction of depth psychology has its own peculiarities.
То есть если Фрейд изучал рефлекс, как это его исследование.
For instance, Freud did investigate reflex.
Да. Юнг инстинкт.
And Jung mainly specialized on instincts.
А Сонди побуждение.
And Leopold Sondy studied drives.
Сегодня перед участником конференции стоит вопрос, насколько интересно было бы ввести новую исследовательскую категорию в академическую психологическую науку, такую категорию, как ущербность.
And today, in this discussion, the participants are confronted with a question. Would it be interesting to introduce a new category into academic psychological science termed as psychology of inferiority?
Вот, в общем-то, так выглядит вопрос номер как бы 1.
So this is question number 1 that we are going to discuss together.
Вопрос номер 2. Пандемия как тест.
The question number 2 is about current pandemic as a test.
Дело в том, что пандемия, как любая экстремальная ситуация, показала людей с самой неблагоприятной, нелицеприятной стороны.
So as any kind of extreme emergency situation, this current pandemic has demonstrated, has revealed people not in their best shapes.
И по сути своей, как бы, нам нужно обсудить, почему люди повели себя в рамках как бы пандемии вот таким способом.
And in the frameworks of this second subject of discussion, we are going to look at the reasons why people around the world did behave the way they did during this current pandemic.
И, в общем-то, третий вопрос – это извечный конфликт между ответственностью и, я бы сказал так, правилами.
And the third subject of our discussion is an eternal conflict between responsibility and rules.
То есть считается, что люди, которые берут на себя ответственность, они почему-то не хотят соблюдать как бы правила.
It is considered that people that are ready to accept responsibility are not willing to follow the rules.
И им это всегда сходит с рук.
And they always get away with that, even though they do not follow the rules.
А в противном случае, наоборот, как бы люди, которые соблюдают правила, они как бы не умеют, не могут на себя взять ответственность, они считаются обязаны подчиняться правилам.
And on the other hand, people that are not capable of accepting responsibility for anything, it is believed that they have to follow the rules.
И по сути своей мы этот конфликт увидели во время мировой пандемии.
And we observed this conflict which took place during this pandemic.
когда мировые правительства нарушали конституции, законы, права человека.
So when world governments of different countries were trespassing the law, they were breaking their own constitution, they were violating human rights and freedoms and other things.
И мы увидели в полной мере реализацию этого старого еще библейского конфликта.
And we saw how this ancient, even we can say biblical conflict was just implemented in the front of our eyes.
Вот, в общем-то, как выглядят три вопроса.
So this is how these three subjects of our talk look like.
Sure that today we will have a brilliant, great discussion because we have three experts in psychology and three experts in philosophy. But as Dr. Maltsev mentioned, the first question, the first subject is the psychology of inferiority as a new category in psychological science. So I give the floor to Dr. Maltsev, please.
Окей, спасибо еще раз за то, что дали мне слово.
Once again, thank you very much for giving me the floor.
Знаете, я классической академической психологией начал заниматься достаточно поздно в своей научной карьере.
So in general, in my scientific career, I have started looking into classic academic science quite lately.
Да. И, в общем-то, когда я приступил к исследовательской деятельности в области психологии,
And when I started my studies in the field of classic psychology,
мне все время казалось, что с этой психологией что-то не так.
I always felt that there's something wrong with this psychology.
Ну, понимаете, когда люди 200 лет занимаются психологией, а толку никакого, то меня это наводит на определенную мысль.
So when people are engaged with a certain subject, let's say with psychology, in the course of 200 years, and there's no point in doing that, and of course, this kind of state of affairs would raise different questions.
Ну, то есть, если явление существует 2000 лет, которое борется с грехом, да, и за 2000 лет его не побороло, значит, вероятно, оно для чего-то другого предназначено.
For instance, if there is a phenomena which is meant to fight with sin, and it is doing so in the course of 2000 years, and still it was not successful, perhaps it means that that phenomena is meant for something different.
Вот то же самое с психологией. Если оно 200 лет борется там с человеческими пороками, там пытается помогать людям, пытается исследовать какие-то категории, то и у этого нет прикладного какого-то выхода, каких-то прикладных успехов, то меня это тоже наводит на определенную мысль.
And the same thing applies to psychology. If it has been practiced in the course of 200 years, trying to help them, assist people in different ways, try to make them less inferior maybe, and at the end there are no practical achievements in the end results in this sphere, then again this state of affairs raises different questions.
И, в общем-то, я привык к совершенно другой психологии.
And I myself, I'm used to different type of psychology.
И вот, когда я пришел в академическую психологию, для меня там все было очень странно.
And when I started, as I said, studying academic psychology, everything seemed very, very strange to me.
То есть огромное количество моих коллег занималось какими-то очень, по их мнению, важными вопросами.
A large number of my colleagues, they were engaged in very important things as they thought to be very important.
Да, то есть я всегда себя спрашивал, для чего они этим занимаются.
And I was always asking why they are doing this.
Ну не может психолог, знаете ли, вот он быть таким умным и при этом сам психически нездоровым.
I mean, it is nuts when a psychologist is so smart and so wise and at the same time so incapable psychologically himself.
Знаете, вот как в Древней Греции доктор исцели себя сам, да?
So it's like in ancient Greece, it was a doctor in the first place had to be capable of healing himself.
И вы знаете, когда я читаю наших мэтров психологии, Юнга, Фрейда, Сонди, я понимаю, что эти люди прошли очень длинный исследовательский как бы путь.
And so when I study our like maestros in psychology, the three names that I have mentioned already, then I can see that they went through a very long journey in their studies.
Да, и всем, что мы имеем сегодня в академической психологии, мы обязаны этим трем людям.
And everything that we have today in the academic psychology, we should be thankful to those three individuals.
Но эти люди не вечны, как и все люди.
And as every human being is, those people are not eternal.
В распоряжении каждого из этих людей как бы был только определенный промежуток исследовательский времени.
And every individual that we have mentioned, they had a certain lifespan that they could devote to their studies.
И каждый из этих людей успел сделать ровно столько, сколько он успел как бы сделать.
And every individual, like Leopold Zondi, Freud, and the Jung, they did as much as they could during their lifetime.
Вот. И по сути своей, после этих двух мэтров, по сути своей, психологическая наука, исследовательская деятельность в области психологии, она как бы пришла в тупик.
And after the death of these three great individuals in academic science, psychological science found itself in a certain lockdown, certain strange situation.
И по сути своей давно назрел следующий шаг, ну, как бы в психологии.
And we feel obliged to make another step in psychology.
И я начал искать этот шаг следующий.
And I was searching for this next step in psychology.
Что мы как бы подразумеваем под психикой человека?
When we say psyche, what do we mean by that?
Да. То есть, по сути своей, все, что сделали наши мэтры, они достаточно мощно описали предыдущие как бы три уровня человеческих как бы реакций и, в общем-то, отношений к окружающему миру.
And what these three individuals did before us is that they made a paramount work in relation to human reactions and relationship of a human with the outer world. So basically they have studied three levels of human being.
И если вы поговорите с любым человеком, то вы как бы поймете, что его вряд ли интересуют его рефлексы, инстинкты или побуждения.
And certainly if you would speak to a usual regular person, it is less likely that he would be interested in his own reflexes, instincts and drives.
Его больше интересует, почему у него вот такая вот жизнь, в которой он как бы живет.
He would be more interested in why his life is the way it is.
И, в общем-то, ему хочется жить иначе, если он не психически нездоров, как бы, да.
And every human being who is psychologically capable and psychologically healthy, he wants to live a better life.
Но он не понимает, что с ним не так.
However, usually a person doesn't understand what exactly is wrong with him.
И поэтому у меня возникла вот категория ущербности, как исследовательская категория академической глубинной психологии, как следующий шаг после побуждения.
And so as the next step after the human drives, I have came up with this category of human inferiority. It is a research category in the depth psychology.
У нас, к сожалению, не так много времени для доклада.
Certainly, we do not have enough time to make like a decent report in here.
Но, как вы понимаете, к исследовательской психологической категории должна предшествовать философская категория.
And I mean, naturally, as it is accepted in real science, before having a psychological category, you have to have a philosophical category that would be preceding it.
И я начал искать философа, который работал с этой проблематикой.
And I have started searching for a philosopher who did work with this problematics.
И я нашел Жана Бодриара.
And I found such a person whose name is Jean Baudrillard.
Жан Бодриар никогда не создавал своей школы психологии.
And Jean Baudrillard never established his own school of psychology.
Он использовал Лакана и Фрейда как двух психологов, на которых он ссылался в ходе своей работы.
Opposite to that, he used prominent figures like Lacan and Freud and referred to them in some of his works.
Это не значит, что он был поклонником Фрейда или Лакана.
And it doesn't mean whatsoever that Jean Baudrillard was an adherent or was a fan of Lacan or Freud.
Но ссылки на этих двух психологов в его работах присутствуют.
However, there are certain references made to these people in his research work.
И, в общем-то, такая мощнейшая школа философии, как школа философии Жана Бодриара,
And Jean Baudrillard's school of psychology would have been a very powerful one.
она, безусловно, как бы должна породить как бы школу психологии.
And Jean Baudrillard's philosophy, as we know, is impeccable, we can say, even so. And certainly this type of grand work, it has to produce a psychological school.
И с моей точки зрения, как бы категория исследовательской ущербности никак, лучше всего подходит как категория, проистекающая из философии Жана Бодриара.
And from my viewpoint, research category as psychology of inferiority, I believe that this fits the best. That would continue logically the Jean Baudrillard's philosophy and approach.
Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you very much for attention.
Thank you, Dr. Maltsov. And the discussion can be continued by Lucien Olakbip.
Okay, good to see you. To all of us. Maybe I was thinking when I heard our colleagues, maybe it means an object like motivation. You know, you have in psychology way, you have reflex, instinct, drive, but also motivation, perspective, and necessity to be recognized by others. And it's why I suppose if you are not recognized by others, the complex of inferiority begin. You have Adler. Adler is Freud colleagues, and he took later about inferiority. But it was a kind of thing to understand the necessity to have a global approach. If you want, a French psychologist, his name is Maurice Roquelin. Maurice Roquelin. He talked about the structuralism analysis. It's necessary to pick up the invariant elements to all human beings to understand how it's possible for the self to develop with satisfaction his own motivation. And in my model, I saw three possibilities, as I wrote in some articles. As like said, the psychology is first. He is right about this. For instance, you have to analyze the subject, the idiosyncrasy, of course, in his own singularity, in his cultural situation, etc. You have also a second item. You have the actor, the political actor. It means the capacity to create the relation, the action, to create the movement, to act. It's second item, and the third item was the social agent, the specialization of inside the society. And the three item subject, actor, agent form the self, not the self. And it's necessary to see how the self can develop himself, to conserve himself, but also to implement himself, to organize himself in a better way, if you want, his action. And you have also two other items with conservation and implemented. You have dispersion and dissolution. Dispersion seems diversity of angles. You cannot analyze just with one factor, if you want, one dimension. You have necessity to. And we have already the discussion, a lot of level of analysis is necessary to understand the behavior of the human. And the last item is the dissolution, discrimination, if you want. Yeah, you have to prioritize your behavior, your motivation, so on. With this global model, you can understand, it seems, the connection between sociology and psychology, and also political behavior, because, for instance, when the self act, he has motivation, of course, but it's necessary to think goal and tools to accomplish his goal, but also to understand the limits of this goal. And it's necessary to sacralize also his own motivation. For instance, to be able to is fiddle at your own action. It's why it's possible to analyze all the behavior with this kind of item. And of course, when you mentioned Baudrillard, he tried, it seems, he tried to analyze how modernity, our condition in the modernity, in the techno-modernity, if you want, with the picture, the technology, the global power, so, and indeed, it's necessary to fight against our inferiority. For instance, I have an example, an anecdote. An anecdote is a little story. One time I was with Baudrillard in his car, and he drives in the autostrade, and suddenly the official 4 or 5 official cars with the president of the French president and the bodyguard, etc. So, and Baudrillard said to me, you have to be strong to counter-react, because we cross their car, and it's necessary to be proud, to be ourselves, and we are not afraid about the power, about the hostility, about the proeminence, about all the distinction, if you want. And for me, it was important to have a lot of resilience about any kind of power. And even if we are not able now to support the contradiction or the force against us, it's necessary to concentrate again, try again to fight against the inferiority. And but I want just finish about maybe the second question about if it's a test or not, the pandemic situation.
Excuse me, Dr. Olahbib,
yes.
It's the second question.
Yes. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
One
we
question.
Answer for the first question after that. Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Olahbib. Thank you. As you remember, the first question is the psychology of inferiority as the new category in psychological sciences. So, Dr. Stephen Best, you can continue this discussion, please.
Okay, hello everybody. It's great to be in your company. I had a few thoughts about this topic, listening to this. The first thought is the influence of social media on people. And it has a very ironic impact as technology.
in that it tends to make people unhappier and more depressed. And that is partly because of sites like Facebook. Everybody shows, and Instagram, how happy their lives are. They don't show the bad parts, the miserable parts, the fights and all that, just, you know, the beautiful parts and the posing and the smiles. And people develop a sense of inferiority because of this kind of social influence and because of that technology. The other side of that is that technology has the ironic effect of making people feel disconnected, alienated, depressed. There's a study showing the relationship between depression and heavy use of social media. And so it both connects us to the world and disconnects us at the same time. And I also think about the role of advertising in society, which is something Baudrillard would very much be able to comment on. Advertising has a distinct function, and that is to produce needs in subjects, to make us feel like we're lacking something, we're inferior in some way. And that lack and inferiority can be overcome through consuming and purchasing a particular product. And then once we use that product, we can be hip, we can be cool, we can get attractive women, whatever. So it's advertising, the function of advertising in many ways is to make us feel inferior and to make us feel that we need to consume things. And so it links the consumption of commodities with happiness, which of course is a false equation. It does not bring happiness, it just brings more needs. You get in an addictive cycle. And you get into what Baudrillard would call a hyper-reality, where you're eventually not sure what the reality is of society or the political world or your own social world anymore. And while it may be fun to live in hyper-reality and consume signs and be entertained by the spectacles of society, it doesn't create a healthy mind and it doesn't create the good life. A meaningful life. And I think people do need a meaningful life or they will fall into unhappiness. If that meaning is struggle against oppression or what have you, I think we do need a meaning in life. That's one thought. A second thought would be a more Marxist response to this issue. And this makes me think of systems of power generally. Every system of power needs a mode of legitimation. Every system of power has to somehow justify itself as good or the best possible social system, worth obeying, worth being a part of. And so systems of power develop systems of ideologies that legitimate that power. And there are two sides of this ideology of systems of power. One would be the ideology of superiority, and the other would be the ideology of inferiority. Ruling classes and ruling elites have to establish themselves as superior in order to legitimate their power. They have specific intelligence, specific genes, specific skills, what have you. They're a superior class. The other people are subservient, they are slaves by nature, we often hear, for instance, Aristotle, because they're inferior and they should be in the slave class. And that makes me think of Aldous Huxley's book, Brave New World, written in 1923, I believe, where brilliant analysis, we see society mass producing human beings in a bottling plant. And one most unfortunate class, the epsilon class, gets air taken out of its brain so that it becomes stupid. So it can be a slave class. So the superior class, in some sense, the flip side of that, I'm saying, they need to create an inferior class too. Not just a class, but a consciousness to go with that. If you look at every ideology of domination, you see the same pattern. You see a radical distinction between two types. The ruler and the ruled. This could be men over women. It could be white people over people of color. It could be humans over animals. very prevalent ideology and form of domination. So you get the ideology of white supremacism. You get the ideology of patriarchy. You get the ideology of speciesism, what have you. You get these specific ideologies, and it's based upon these dualisms. So men and women are not just radically distinct, these get arranged in a hierarchy. Whites and people of color, or colonizer and colonized, are not just different, they're radically different, and that difference needs to be arranged hierarchically. There's a logic of domination in every hierarchy. Racism, sexism, classism, elitism, speciesism, all work on the very same logic of domination. And so that would be a Marxist point, that every system of power needs an ideology, a psychology of domination. And one aspect of that is to make the ruling class feel superior. White supremacism, right? Class domination, class elitism, and make the other class feel inferior. Frantz Fanon in 1961 wrote a very popular Marxist type critique of colonialism. This is called The Wretched of the Earth. And in this book, Fanon tried to describe the psychological effects of being colonized. And he well appreciated that to liberate people from colonialism, you have to also liberate their thinking, their mentalities, because they internalize the colonizer's mentality, and that has to be eradicated. It's a bit like the Marxist idea of class consciousness. You have to develop a liberatory consciousness, a consciousness that wants freedom and demands freedom and knows how to take freedom. But I also am thinking now, finally, third and finally, of the Nietzschean concept of inferiority. And maybe, Oleg, you've thought about this or can make more of this in your work, because for Nietzsche, resentment was a central psychological category. And here again, it's something like the Marxist idea that there is a ruling class and a ruled class, except for Nietzsche, those higher types, those with great genius and ability and bold strength and cunning, or the lower types, the mediocrities of society, the herd animals, as Nietzsche would say. And the herd animals resented those who were strongest over them, just as the Christian slave class resented the Roman warriors ruling over them. And so they created, the Christian slave class, what Nietzsche called the slave revolt in morality. The slave revolt in morality is the inversion of values, where everything that is good for the higher types becomes bad. Everything that is strong becomes some kind of evil. And so they invert that and they make weakness and submission virtues. And they turn weakness into a virtue rather than a vice. It's the revaluation of values. And so now, the meek shall inherit the earth, that type of thinking. And Nietzsche thought that was decisive, not only in the slave revolt of morality and overturning the Roman Empire and creating the Christian Empire, but that this mentality, this psychology of resentment, influenced all of Western thought and is very much in modern egalitarian ideology, socialism, anarchism, egalitarianism, feminism, etc. In each case, there's a ruled class that feels made to feel inferior, but resents the stronger type. And so they are going to invert their values. They're going to project resentment into the moral and psychological sphere of society. And so it's a common everyday phenomenon. People often resent other people who are perhaps better than them, in better positions than them. It's a human trait to feel this envy and resentment. And Nietzsche thinks it affected the whole sphere of morality. But it begins with a sense of inferiority. And one way to overcome that inferiority is to turn that into some kind of virtue or create yourself as some ruling class. But I think the Marxist and Nietzschean analyses are very fertile for analyzing the psychological category of inferiority.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen Best. And I give the floor to Professor Maxim Lepsky, please.
Добрый день, или точнее уже вечер, дорогие коллеги. Спасибо, что есть возможность поделиться своими размышлениями. Я знаком с теорией Олега Викторовича Мальцева. Мы с Александром Николаевичем обсуждали это на симпозиуме в Палермо. И хотел бы поделиться с теми моментами, которые для меня важны.
Good evening, everybody. I'm very glad to be here today, and I should say that I'm acquainted with the theory of Dr. Oleg Maltsev. We have discussed this in Palermo Symposium together also with Professor Sagaidak.
Начнем с того, что мы обычно категорию рассматриваем только тогда, когда отражены очень важные существенные закономерности.
So first thing that has to be pointed out that we start taking into consideration different categories when there are different factors that necessitate it.
Сложность категории ущербность состоит в том, что в теории риска ущерб изначально негативная коннотация.
So complexity of theory of inferiority is in that in the theory of risk, it has a negative connotation from the beginning.
Потому что ущерб – это обычно либо потеря чего-то, либо недополучение чего-то.
Because usually when we say inferior or inferiority, what do we mean by that? We think that there are losses or something, shortage of something.
Как свойство, ущербность уже характеризует какие-то отношения, которые носят устойчивый и долговременный характер.
As a quality, inferiority itself is something that that means that the relationships have a long-term basis.
И вот здесь, на мой взгляд, удачно была концепция как раз пирамиды ущербности, которая была предложена на симпозиуме.
And I think in this part, the pyramid of inferiority, which was presented during the international symposium, was a very successful one.
Поскольку мы не отказывались от диалектического подхода, естественно, всегда важна и противоположная категория ущербности.
Since we do not exclude the dialectical approach, we also have to keep in mind the opposite of the inferiority.
И вот здесь обращение к Бодрияру мне кажется вполне уместным.
And I think in this point, the reference to Jean Baudrillard is quite relevant.
Поскольку здесь соотношение идет объективного и гиперреального.
Since we are looking at the correlation of objective and hyperreal.
Одновременно, как социолог, я знаю, что ущербность вполне уместная категория и при анализе другой категории, которая известна как депривация, которую изучал Теодор Роберт Гар.
And as a sociologist, I do believe that inferiority is a very relevant subject to research, and also it has another close subject to it, which is called deprivation, which was researched by Robert Gard.
Теодор Роберт Гар.
Теодор Роберт Гар.
Так вот, если мы говорим об ущербности как категории, которая позволяет людей сопоставлять себя с объективным миром или социальными отношениями, тогда появляется новый, достаточно мощный простор для исследований.
And if we consider the category as inferiority in correlation with objectivity and the social world where one can exist, then it would be possible to do so.
Террорист, если он обладает характеристикой ущербности, что пытается вернуть или чему пытается отомстить в этом мире?
So if a terrorist, let's imagine that he has the characteristics of inferiority, then in such a case, what he is trying to revenge in this world, or whom he is trying to revenge?
Религия, которая пытается примирить человека с его недополученными социальными умениями, навыками и будущим.
Religion that is trying to make him keep up with things that he did not learn or he was not capable of learning during his lifetime.
Уже не работает, когда происходит пандемия и ущербность носит характер биологический.
And this doesn't work during the pandemic period when the inferiority already has the biological component.
И здесь появляются и те основания, которые не носят объективный характер, как, собственно, информационная пандемия, как характеристика массовой ущербности.
And certainly in here, there is no objectivity, because when we speak about the pandemic, it has an informationary factor, which is massive.
И у меня тогда возникает вопрос по поводу не просто психологической категории, а прежде всего философской категории.
And certainly in such a case, I end up asking myself a question which doesn't relate to psychological category, but relates to philosophical one.
Если происходит экзистенциальный кризис, и человек не верит ни в себя, ни в религию, ни в государство, ни в науку, то что у него остается?
So if there is an existential crisis and a person doesn't believe in himself, he doesn't believe into government, he doesn't believe to anything, so what he is left with in such a case?
Вполне вероятно только свобода и способность жить собственным разумом.
It is likely that he is left with only with a freedom and with his own will to continue this life.
Поэтому я предполагаю, что при формировании таких мощных глобальных угроз необходимо рассмотреть не только ущербность, но и противоположную категорию. Какую, здесь еще, мне кажется, вопрос открыт.
So in the times of formation such global threats, I think it is relevant not only to consider category as inferiority, but also a category which would be opposite to it. And what is it? We do not know yet. This question is open.
Вот у нас произошло послабление мер карантинных, и сразу появились бунтующие люди.
For instance, in the country where I live, the quarantine measures were a little loosened up. They were weakened a little bit. And right away, we end up having different people that are rioting in the streets.
Они бунтуют против ущербного правительства или против своей ущербности?
So the question is, are they revolting against the government's inferiority, or are they revolting against their own inferiority?
Если малый и средний бизнес, понятно, против чего бунтуют. Они против ущерба, которого, той прибыли, которую недополучили, и возможности выжить в этих условиях.
If we are speaking about small businesses, then it is clear that they are revolting against the fact that they lost a lot of income and they are trying to survive in this situation.
И еще очень важный момент. Когда-то еще Платон говорил о том, что реформы могут быть существенными, когда рассматривается существо дела, или косметическими. Так вот, ущербность принятых решений часто наводит лоск с помощью косметики информационных мер.
Plato once said that when it comes to reforms, we have substantial reforms and not substantial reforms that are considered almost like cosmetic ones. So usually when we are speaking about inferiority, it happens that we are speaking about cosmetic.
Пожалуй,
Просьба резюмировать в течение минуты. Please sum up in 1 minute.
Пожалуй, именно это те моменты, которые я хотел бы вынести тоже на обсуждение по первому вопросу. Спасибо за внимание.
So in relation to the question one, the things that I have mentioned, I would also discuss them if possible. Thank you very much for attention.
Thank you, Professor Lepsky, and I give the floor to Professor Vitaly Lunyov, please.
Уважаемые коллеги, добрый вечер. Очень рад присоединиться к сегодняшней дискуссии.
Good evening, dear colleagues. I'm very happy to greet you all and happy to be here.
Когда я услышал от доктора Мальцева такую категорию, как ущербность или психология ущербности, у меня сразу возникла такая необходимость найти, ну, собственно, язык, на который можно опираться для понимания этой категории, потому что она меня достаточно сильно увлекла, довольно-таки емкая категория.
So when I heard for the first time when Dr. Maltsev used a psychology of inferiority or inferiority as such, I felt very compelled to understand this thing. And I thought that we do need a certain language that would help us to understand this psychology of inferiority, because for me personally, I find this thing very interesting and I would like to look into it.
Вначале это немного напоминает позицию Адлера с его комплексом неполноценности. И в дальнейшем, когда начинаешь глубже разбираться в этом аспекте, понимаешь, что это не совсем так.
So from the first viewpoint, it reminds the Adler's complex of not being fulfilled or not being full, like something like inferiority. But after a while, I do understand that the psychology of inferiority is different than what Adler taught.
И проблема в том, что глубинная психология всегда опиралась на чей-то язык. Например, на язык физики, на язык неврологии, на язык лингвистики, культурологии и многих других наук. А вот в данном случае практически, ну, во всяком случае для меня это так звучит и прозвучало, что речь идет, ну, буквально о языке экономики, права и, может, даже криминалистики, когда мы говорим об ущербности.
So in general, when we are speaking about depth psychology, we certainly refer also to neurology, linguistics, and many other sciences. But when we were speaking about psychology of inferiority, for me personally, I noticed that it is more directed to the economics, power, and this kind of categories.
Поэтому, по большему счету, содержание психологии ущербности или вообще ущербности как таковой, это то, что относит нас к теме лишения. Лишение, потеря, изъятие, в конечном итоге к первичному дефициту, чего бы то ни было.
So when we speak about inferiority, in the first place, what comes to mind to us is that something was taken away from somebody, or this initial deficit, as we would term it.
И это очень напоминает, ну, по сути, картину потерянного рая или потерю вот такое отлучение от чего-то такого, что было изначально, но в результате оказалось потерянным. Ты оказался отлученным от чего-то.
And also what comes to my mind is a certain image of a paradise that was taken away from people, something that belonged to people before, but then later on they're left without it. That's what comes to my mind when we speak about inferiority.
И если мы говорим о глубинной психологии, то вот такая потеря, которая впервые ощущается субъектом, она как раз связана с тем, что он становится за пределами желания значимых для него фигур изначально.
And if we are speaking about depth psychology, then it is about certain loss that was experienced by a subject for the first time in his life, and that when he goes beyond the desires of figures that were important for him.
Также, когда мы говорим об ущербности, мы всегда подразумеваем наличие другого. потому что без этого другого стать ущербным невозможно.
And also, when we speak about inferiority, we suppose that there is an alternative, because it is not possible to be inferior if you have nothing to compare with.
Поэтому мы можем говорить о том, что ущербность тесно связана изначально с чьей-то потребностью. Моя личная ущербность изначально связана с потребностью кого-то другого или чего-то другого. Это принципиально важный тезис.
And so very important thesis is that we could have said that inferiority is always related with initial demand or drive of somebody else.
Второй очень важный момент связан с тем, что ущербность связана с желанием быть признанным другим и потребностью в этом другом.
The second important point is that inferiority is linked to the desire to be accepted by somebody else, to be hurt by other people.
И свою потребность мы ощущаем только посредством другого.
And we feel that we are in demand only by means of somebody else.
И еще один тезис, на котором я бы хотел остановиться, это то, что ущербность всегда связана с первичными объектами, которыми могут выступать, в буквальном смысле слова, отец и мать, а соответственно речь идет о конфликте желания и закона. И это становится одной из серьезных базовых первопричин следующей ущербности.
Also, the next point is that the inferiority is initially linked to two important subjects for every human being from their childhood, which is mother and father figures. So because of the conflict of a desire and the law, we end up having the first basic foundation that leads to inferiority.
И если вот резюмировать такие теоретические позиции, мы можем прийти примерно к следующему выводу.
To conclude,
то, что, собственно, желание другого является, невозможность преодолеть это желание становится основой для переживания субъектом ущербности как таковой. И единственный выход из состояния ущербности, по сути, может быть связан с возможностью сформировать только свое желание. А для этого нужно преодолеть тревогу и опереться на необходимый ресурс. Вот такое видение ущербности я бы хотел сегодня представить.
So to conclude the aforementioned theses that I have said, the inferiority, what leads us to inferiority is the desire of somebody else and incapability to implement that desire. So the exit from this condition, in my viewpoint, is to form your own desires, to be free from the anxiety and to, start living by your own desires. So this is how I see inferiority.
Thank you, Professor Lubnov. Thank you. And the discussion can be continued by Alexander Sagaidak, please.
Здравствуйте, коллеги. Очень рад вас всех приветствовать в этой дискуссии.
Greetings, colleagues. I'm very glad to greet you all in this discussion.
И говоря о категории ущербности, конечно же, в первую очередь возникает аналогия с индивидуальной психологией Альфреда Адлера, комплекс неполноценности.
And so certainly when we are speaking about psychology of inferiority, first thing that comes to our mind is Alfred Adler's complex of inferiority.
Но по моим представлениям мы имеем дело как раз вот с классическим витком диалектической спирали, поскольку комплекс неполноценности – это был сформированный Адлером ответ на вызов, который предъявляла личности тогдашняя эпоха.
However, I see that the thing that we are discussing is different, because when we speak about Alfred Adler's complex of deficiency or inferiority was about classical dialectical spiral, which was basically a response to a challenge to the human beings that of this or that epoch.
В наше время мы сталкиваемся уже с более масштабной задачей. И почему необходимо введение категории ущербности? Потому что есть вызов, который брошен уже не личности, а в целом обществу.
And in our times, I think it is necessary to introduce a category such as inferiority for the reason that our task is bigger in scale, it's global scale. For the reason that challenge currently is directed not to personalities or separate individuals, but to whole masses and whole societies.
Вряд ли приходится сомневаться, что одной из самых серьезных психологических проблем общества потребления, в котором мы живем, является инфантилизм.
And we cannot doubt that one of the most serious psychological problems of consumer society today is being infantile.
И простите мне такую катахрезу, но мы можем сказать, что инфантильный регресс прогрессирует.
And excuse me for the expression that I will tell right now, I would term it like this, that infantile regress is progressing.
А одним из обязательных атрибутов инфантилизма, как мы знаем, является нарциссизм.
And as we know, one of the attributes of infantile individuals is being narcissistic.
А что является лучшим лекарством от нарциссизма, по крайней мере, на начальном этапе?
So what is the best medicine for narcissism, at least in the first stage?
Разумеется, ощущение своего несовершенства.
And certainly the medicine on the first stage would be understanding or recognizing your own imperfection.
И если вот эта инфантильная нарциссичность, она фактически стала уже стилем жизни,
and since this infantile narcissism already became a certain lifestyle,
особенно благодаря интернету, который позволяет создавать иллюзорную реальность,
especially thanks to internet that creates this illusionary reality,
то возвращение уже не отдельного человека, а целого общества к реалистичному восприятию себя,
then the return of not a single human being, but of the masses to the realistic perception of them,
возможно, в обязательном порядке через вот эту категорию, через это состояние своего несовершенства, а уж если называть вещи все-таки своими именами, именно категорию ущербности.
So this return to the realistic state of affairs, realistic perception of oneself is possible by means this category that would basically give an understanding that people are not perfect, and if to term it even more exactly, then that people are inferior.
Точно так же мы знаем, что в обществе потребления инфантилизм в обязательном порядке связан с конформизмом.
And also, we do know that in the consumer society, the infantile phenomena is certainly linked with conformism or being antagonistic.
Быть таким, как все, быть растворенным в массе, это признак, если не превосходства, то, по крайней мере, состоятельности.
So being different from everybody else, like being very, very different, is something which is considered to be fine.
Соответственно, отделить себя от массы, а нередко это означает и противопоставить себя ей, автоматически на первом этапе предполагает ощущение ущербности.
So, excuse me for the first comment. So basically, it is for majority of people, it's very hard to be different from everybody else because of the social pressure and etc. So on the first stage, when somebody tries to become better, tries to become different than everybody else, that would almost mean that he is being antagonistic against whole society.
В рамках нашего подхода, метода глубинных трансформаций, мы уделяем ключевое внимание понятию аутентичности.
In the frameworks of the approach that I use, depth transformation, we pay much attention to authenticity.
Так вот, как показывает практика, в условиях такого конформистского, инфантильного общества потребления, войти в состояние своей аутентичности зачастую означает ощутить свое изгойство.
Thus, as experience shows, in this consumer society, which is conformist and immature or infantile, when somebody is trying to reach his authenticity, it usually means that he would feel inferior.
В сущности, это то же самое экзистенциальное одиночество, о котором и говорят экзистенциалисты.
In fact, this is existential loneliness that is being propagated by existentialists.
Но если говорить о именно психологическом измерении этого состояния, то вошедший в состояние аутентичности человек в первую очередь ощущает ущербность своей воли.
However, if we would speak in the framework of psychological dimension of this state, when somebody enters this authentic state of himself, on the first place, he starts feeling inferiority of his own will.
Просьба постараться в минуту суммировать. Please sum up in 1 minute. Thank you.
И именно осознавание, проживание ущербности своей воли
and conscious living and experiencing the inferiority of your own will
является для человека начальной возможностью для своего аутентичного становления,
is the first initial point that allows a person to start living his authentic way of life.
И дальнейшего целостного пути самореализации, который Юнг называл индивидуацией.
And also it allows to continue to move to other steps of lives that was termed by Jung. The next step is individual type of thing. It's all related to individual.
Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you very much for your attention.
I think that it's a good idea to give a floor to Dr. Maltsev, maybe to comment some statements of his colleague as an author of this new category of psychological science. Олег Викторович, если пожелаете, есть возможность 2-4 минуты прокомментировать все, что вы услышали, потому что вы являетесь, собственно, автором этой новой концепции.
Я вообще благодарю коллег за столь содержательную дискуссию.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank my colleagues for such a meaningful discussion.
И с моим великим уважением к профессору Лепскому.
With my big respect to Professor Lepsky,
я хочу ответить на те вопросы, которые он поставил.
I would like to answer questions that he had said.
Во-первых, как мы говорим, что противоположно ущербности?
In the first place, he mentioned what is opposite to inferiority.
Вопрос нормы.
And here's the answer. It's about the norm.
с которой очень большая проблема в психологии.
And there is a huge problem in psychology with this norm.
Понимаете, норма в психологии – это некая размытая категория сегодня.
Because when we speak about what is normal, in psychology, it is a very vague and abstract term.
Она некая, знаете, плавающая и изменяющаяся.
So that concept, it's so vague that it constantly changes.
И вы понимаете, в общем-то, у меня были случаи, когда я разговаривал с достаточно уважаемыми профессорами, психологами.
And I experienced several cases when I used to speak with very respected professors and psychologists.
И они на полном серьезе утверждали, что люди, которые каждый месяц выстраиваются за зарплатой к другим людям, они нормальные, а те, кто им платит зарплату, это ненормальные.
And those distinguished psychologists, they were completely serious when they were telling that people that line up every month to get their wage or payment are normal. However, people that are actually earning money and paying them those wages are abnormal.
То есть, по сути своей, как бы ущербность, как категория глубинной психологии, как исследовательская категория глубинной психологии, жестко ставит вопрос нормы.
So basically, the research category is inferiority in depth psychology. It is very strict. It is very strict when it comes to norm in defining what is normal.
Ответ на второй вопрос, что является философской категорией, символьная составляющая.
And the answer to the second question asked by Professor Lepsky, it is about symbolic component.
Хотелось бы вернуться к ущербности.
And I would like to come back to inferiority.
Есть ли следующая надстройка над ущербом, над нормой?
Do we have another level which goes beyond, which goes one step higher than the norm?
Это могущество.
Then yes, there is, and it is like supremacy, or when a person is capable of fulfilling anything.
То есть могущество – это единственная категория, как бы лишенная ущербности.
And this strength or might is the only exclusive category which is not inferior.
Тот самый понтифик оппозиторум со ссылкой на как бы Леопольда Сонди.
So it is that very one Pontifex Oppositorium which was termed by Leopold Sondi, that part of a human being which is capable of solving any type of tasks.
И, конечно, мое почтение, профессор Сагайдак.
And I would move and with my all respect, I greet Professor Sagaidak.
И все, что мне хочется сказать, Александр Николаевич, очень жаль, что они в массе не чувствуют себя ущербными.
Everything that I would like to tell is, Professor Sagaidak, I'm very sorry that people do not feel themselves inferior in masses.
Я закончил. Спасибо большое.
This is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maltsev. So we can go to the second topic of our discussion, and it's a pandemic as a test or a project. So, Dr. Maltsev, you can start, please.
Спасибо, что дали слово.
Thank you for giving me the floor.
Вы знаете, в момент пандемии я находился вместе с профессором Лепским в самом центре ее как бы развития, существования в Европе.
As I have mentioned, during the outbreak of pandemic, together with Professor Lepsky, I was in the heart of this outbreak in Europe.
И мне бы совсем не хотелось обсуждать поведение людей, то есть приводить конкретные примеры по причине того, что это ужасно.
And I do not really want to provide specific examples about how people behaved, because this is not something nice to hear.
И, в общем-то, вы все увидите на фотографиях и прочитаете в монографии, которую я закончил писать, и которая вот-вот выйдет, которая называется «Как меня заставили изучать психологию Европы».
for the reason that people that would desire to look at those pictures that I took of this situation and things that I've wrote, they will be able to read it in my monograph, which is titled "How Was I Forced to Study the Psychology of Europe?"
Это продолжение нашей работы с Виталием Евгеньевичем Луневым, как бы над психологией Юга Италии. Но у нас так получилось в этот раз, что мы уже изучали психологию Европы, а не психологию Юга Италии. Да.
And this aforementioned monograph is the continuation of our work with Professor Lunev, dedicated to the psychology of Southern Italy. However, this time we studied the psychology of Europe.
И огромный вклад в этот научный труд внес профессор Лепский, который, в общем-то, и участвовал непосредственно, да и в самой научной экспедиции, и очень многие главы этой книги – это результат наших научных дискуссий с Максимом Анатольевичем.
And Dr. Lepsky also made a big contribution to this monograph, and this monograph has a lot of discussions of me and Dr. Lepsky.
Да. И по сути своей, что я хотел бы обсудить в рамках того времени, которое мне отведено на доклад.
So here's what I would like to discuss during these minutes that are allocated for the speech.
Если мы представим психику как некую антенну приемную,
so if we imagine our psyche as a certain antenna which is accepting different information,
то вот в самом низу будет рефлекс.
Then at the bottom of it you would have reflexes.
А в самом верху будет символьная как бы составляющая.
And at the beginning, at the top of this antenna, there would be symbolic component.
Так вот, очень удивительно было видеть, что кроме рефлекса никакой другой реакции по сути своей в Европе в момент пандемии не было.
And it was surprising to see that during the pandemic in the Europe we saw nothing but reflex reactions.
Я крайне солидарен с доктором Александром Николаевичем Сагайдаком с тем, что по сути своей по реакции европейских граждан можно было изучать детскую, вот эту вот самую подростковую психологию.
And in this point, I would totally agree with Dr. Sagaidak that when you are studying the reactions of Europe during this pandemic, that is a perfect sample to study the juvenile psychology or infantile psychology.
То есть, по сути своей, такого инфантилизма я не видел в жизни никогда.
I should confess that I have never seen this type of immaturity ever.
И когда-то на собрании одесского психолога философского общества Александр Николаевич Сагайдак сказал, что человек общества потребления – это крайне лояльный человек, он живет за счет лояльности и толерантности.
And during one of the meetings of psychological and philosophical community, Dr. Sagaidak told that the masses basically they live on the basis of a certain solidarity.
Но ни лояльности, ни толерантности в момент пандемии я не увидел.
And also that people during this type of situations in the masses, they usually are loyal and very tolerant. However, during this pandemic period in Europe, I did not see loyalty nor tolerance.
И я, конечно, мог бы понять, когда некие люди выгребают из супермаркетов продукты, туалетную бумагу и прочие как бы вещи, пусть даже так.
And so when people are even basically emptying the supermarkets, making the Hummer purchase or whatever, and they're just buying all of the toilet paper and etc. Okay, let it be.
Но меня удивило другое.
But I was surprised at something different, not because of the situation in the supermarkets, something else.
тот уровень, который как бы, то есть уровень управления, то есть это президенты, премьер-министры, канцлеры как бы Европы, который должен был реагировать совершенно на другом уровне этой антенны психики.
What I was surprised is because of the level of management of presidents, prime ministers, councillors that supposedly had to react on the different level of this antenna, not the reflex one.
Они реагировали на том же самом уровне рефлекса, как и все остальные граждане.
And unfortunately, they did react on the reflex level just the way regular populations did.
Одно заявление Ангелы Меркель меня вообще поставило в тупик.
One of the statements of Angela Merkel did shock me.
Она сказала, что мы закрываем немецкие границы, нарушая Шенгенское соглашение, потому что вы съедите нашу еду, и у нас не хватит больничных коек.
She said, in a nutshell, she said that we are closing the Germany's borders and we are trespassing the Schengen law agreement because other people will come and eat our food and take up our beds in the hospitals.
То есть, по сути своей, Ангела Меркель считает, что она может, как канцлер, так реагировать как бы в условиях ну, как бы смертельной опасности.
So Angela Merkel, as a chancellor, she thinks it is totally fine for her, as a chancellor of the country, to react as such in the states of emergency.
Я считаю, что вот эта пандемия, она как раз максимально обнажила вот эту самую как бы ущербность людей в этом мире. То есть сказка кончилась.
And I think that this pandemic situation, it revealed, it naked this inferiority of people, and the story, like fairy tales, they are over.
Иллюзии разбиты.
There are no illusions anymore.
А ущербность, она, в общем-то, вся налицо. То есть, как бы, откройте интернет, посмотрите, как эти люди сходят с ума, как бы, от придуманной пандемии, и вы поймете, кто эти люди.
And the inferiority of people is just too obvious. If you just even open the internet and if you observe how people are behaving in the frameworks of setup of artificial pandemics, then like everything becomes, I mean, so clear.
Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you very much for attention.
Maltsev, and I give the floor to Dr. Ola Bip.
Thank you. There are a lot of to say, even in the first place, in other question, but in the second topic, I suppose Professor Oleg Maltsev is right to say, and also Vitaly Gunov and also what is Leipzig, Maxim Leipzig, about the infantilization, inferiority, but maybe globally, if you want, no, because I hesitated because I want to answer his other questions in the first step. For instance, for like just a parenthesis, maybe the contrary of normal is accomplishment. Accomplishment will be the contrary of normal, but how it's possible to be accomplished now, of course, because we, in front of the modelization, the network, all the system of techno-scientism organization, all people feels very inferior, and the complex of inferiority is not it's necessary to take this in the general point, not just, of course, in Adler point. You have to generalize. We have the complex about the people who talk in the TV, in the field, in the network. The problem of the to be new by the audience, public, and so on. It's why we have a lot of sentiments, feelings of inferiority in this context. It's why we can obey at the rules, because we believe that our dirigents, our leaders knew better than us the situation. It is the first point. But in the second thought, I am asking myself, maybe there is maybe a test or a project. It's not necessary to see a conspiracy theory necessary, but if you see the situation as a professor like myself said, it's a very artificial pandemic because the numbers are very low globally. Every year in the world, you have between 200,000 and 500,000 dead by the flu, by the influenza, and all the statistics, even OMS statistics, global statistics said we are now under the annual estimation of pulmonary infection and so on. It's why indeed interesting to understand why now and not last year and not the next year, what now? Of course, the human history is maybe a succession of opportunities. Maybe the virus, the Chinese virus, is just an accident. He escapes from a laboratory, a French-Chinese laboratory, because the French provide the finance inside the P4 laboratory in Yuan, and maybe it's an accident. But in France, you have the Minister of the Health, Agnès Buzyn, decide to make the hydrochloroquine, the Didier Raoult treatment, inside the forbidden poison. It's very strange because this kind of treatment generally is you can take it without ordinance, without asking to the doctor. It's possible to take this treatment. Oh, in the end of January, suddenly this kind of medicament, of medicine, has been forbidden in France, in Europe, and so on. The possibility is an accident, I said, and a coordination, aggregation of opportunities, and also a contradiction between the panic, the true panic inside the deciders. The deciders suddenly, when they heard maybe this pandemic is very violent and you will be, we will have millions of dead. It's why it's necessary to be confined like in China. It's a possibility. The panic, the decider panics because they seem inferior to the numbers, the scientists. The scientists decide the Ferguson, the statistician, Britain statistician said, oh la la, we have millions dead, it's necessary to stop immediately. It's a possibility. But why in the same time you have the interdiction to take this medicament as hydrochloroquine and antibiotic also, and the combination of hydrochloroquine and also antibiotic, as Didier Raoult in Marseille in France said, and now you in Africa, all the Africa take this kind of medicament, all Africa. It's why I suppose you have the possibility of the conjunction of two possibilities. The accident, the sentiment of inferiority, even inside the decider, but also you have, because this medicament is forbidden, a test about the necessity to build the transition, the ecology transition, the necessity to reopen in other kind of economic field, because the usual object of consumption we have not enough money to take with the traditional object of consumption. It's necessary to adopt a new consumption, internet consumption, advertising consumption, of course, video game, of course, and also electric and a lot of also bio-medicament, anxiety, because as the Dr. Stephen Best said, yes, advertising, hyperreality create a lot of anxiety. For instance, in France, a lot of people take a lot of psychotic medicament to calm themselves. It's why it's very. You have in France, for instance, a fight between soft medicine and hard medicine, and it's why it's very interesting to understand this kind of matter. And in my conclusion,
1 minute.
yes, in my conclusion, I will say it's necessary to observe with a lot of minutie the continuing situation, and I suppose it is both. It is an accident, panic, but also is a test, an opportunity to organize the global society in the techno bio industrial way.
Thank you, Professor Lagbib. I believe these topics are very interesting, but please, dear colleagues, try to sum up your speech in 7-8 minutes. Thank you for your understanding. So I give the floor to Steve Best.
Hi. Is it a test or is it a project? It's a good question. The term project to me suggests a conspiracy, that it's someone's project, it's someone's agenda, it's happened or being manipulated by certain interests for specific reasons. I heard the phrase artificial pandemic, and I heard the pandemic compared to the flu. I may not be thinking correctly about this, so please point out where I'm wrong. But these are the things here in America that Trump says a lot. And so I'm a little skeptical of that. The pandemic here in the United States, which is being hit harder than any other country, is very real. I experience it to be very real. It could be I'm deluded and I should go out and enjoy my life in bars and restaurants like lots of other people are doing right now. But I don't feel that that is a rational thing to do. And so I remain imprisoned in my private solipsistic self. Still over 2,000 people are dying in America every day. Nursing homes and churches and other mass events have bred a lot of contagion. So it feels very real to me. And is it an accident? Is one question. We don't know yet the origins of the virus. It probably came from a live market in Wuhan, China. It might have been bioengineered, which is a favorite theory of Trump. But the medical science doesn't seem to detect evidence of that. Of course, there could be a conspiracy for that. It might have been an accident, but I don't think accident is the right way to phrase it because it was inevitable. And it's inevitable because of our relationship to the natural world. It's inevitable because we are destroying ecosystems. We are destroying biodiversity. We are coming into ever closer contact with thousands of viruses that are in the forest and in the wilderness. And so as we encroach deeper into the natural world, we encounter more viruses and more diseases, and we will continue to do so. There have been dozens of outbreaks of various diseases that have come, for instance, from animals to humans. Ebola was such a case. It was rather quickly and efficiently contained. It's still out there. There's no cure for it. This virus will likely be out there indefinitely. But I have to say it feels real to me. I don't think gravity is a linguistic construction. If I did, I'd go jump off a building. It seems real to me, but I don't jump off buildings. I do think the pandemic is not an artificial construction by political elites. So I don't go into crowded bars. And I have a genuine sense of fear and paranoia of that. And again, it could have happened for one reason or another and be exploited by the elite. Now that doesn't surprise me. There have been very fertile theories here in the US, you might know, about 9/11 as a conspiracy, that the elite made 9/11 happen so that they could pass all kinds of repressive anti-terror laws and surveil and attack the public. And surely that they did. If they didn't cause the crisis, I don't know. There are theories that they did. The elite, the political elite, they sure exploited it. So we could say that this crisis, whatever its origins, is a kind of Trojan horse. It carries lots of opportunities for authoritarian elites to exploit. We see Trump and the Republicans in the United States exploiting this to control abortion policy, to control voting procedures, to create a sense of fear in the public as they're telling us everything's okay, so that we re-elect President Trump and we don't take any chances with a new president during this crisis. It is definitely a Trojan horse and has lots of opportunities for an authoritarian to exploit. But I don't want to erase the larger ecological facts of human beings destroying ecosystems around the world. And that is causing thousands of bacterial, viral, and other types of diseases to emerge into the world and to create pandemics. And there will be future pandemics, and they won't be accidents. Is it a project? I don't know. Maybe someone can convince me it is. Maybe I'll be shown that it is a project. It's a manipulated phenomenon. But for now, I just feel that it's very real and dangerous. It's dangerous. I mean, schools have closed, sporting events have closed, social life is basically shut down. It's being reopened right now in the United States, but under various dangerous conditions. They just reopened in Texas, where I live, 2 days ago. And on that very same day, we saw the highest daily spike in Texas death rates yet. So there can be a second wave. This is what happened during the 1918 Spanish flu. It actually originated in Kansas. There was a second wave. It was the second wave that was most deadly. And we're waiting for a second wave now, and it'll probably come in the fall or winter, according to best scientific evidence. Is it a task? A test is definitely a test. It's a test of political leadership. We see Trump gloriously failed that. He's incompetent, he's incoherent. And right now in this country, we have the biggest crisis we've had since the Spanish flu or since the Great Depression a century ago. And we have the most corrupt, most incompetent, most sociopathic president we've ever had in our history. That's a bad combination to have. So it's a test of political leadership, for sure. It's a test of the scientific world. Can they respond to this crisis? Can they understand this and advance medical science further? It's a test of individual resolve, for sure, as Oleg was talking about. Can people be patient? Can they be tolerant? I have to say people in this country are failing that test. At least what seems to be a vocal minority. These are the people who go to the state capital of Michigan and Wisconsin with their swastikas and their Nazi flags and their automatic weapons and their hate and their racism. And they say, open this country. And they feel like Trump wants them to do that. And Trump approves of these protests. It's disgusting. So it was said in the last conference by another speaker that the US is responding in unity, in harmony. This is such a joke. This country is so filled with hatred and racism and white supremacism and Nazism. All you got to do is just scratch the surface and it erupts. It's always been there. It was there before Trump, but Trump brings it all out and he legitimates it. So we are not responding to this crisis responsibly with a solidarity. It is the culture wars. It is a division in America between Republicans and Democrats. There is hatred spewing out, at least from the Republican side. And you can see it in their demonstrations. The racism is coming to the foreground of America and being validated by Trump. It was said that during 9/11, there was a together kumbaya moment. And maybe there was. We had a different president then who was a little bit more competent as a leader, but still not my choice as a Republican and corporate elite.
Sum up in minutes.
Sure. Okay. So we had that moment in America over 9/11 for maybe 2 weeks. We haven't had that at all over this global pandemic. This country is more divided than ever, and so that is frightening to see. So, test is a good word for this. We are being tested. Your character is tested during difficult times. The character of this nation is being tested right now, and I think it's failing abysmally. Our leaders have failed us. Many people are failing us. The scientific establishment is muzzled and marginalized, and we are being tested in terms of whether we can live a different way, a different relationship with the natural world, because it is our predatory lifestyle that is, and the killing of animals that is creating these pandemics and will continue to create pandemics.
Thank you, Dr. Best. Thank you. And Professor Maxim Lepsky, you can continue this discussion, please.
Спасибо за предоставленное слово.
Thank you for giving me the floor.
По поводу теста и проекта, тут как раз, я думаю, что эта проблематика Олегом Викторовичем была сформулирована еще во время нашей экспедиции, потому что очень это все напоминало на тест.
When we are speaking about the project or the test, then this problematic was already formulated by Dr. Maltsev when we were in the expedition, because everything that is going on does really resemble a test.
Второй момент, который подтверждал, что это все-таки, наверное, тест, это была публикация Константина Слободенюка, который...
The second point that confirms that this was a test was a publication of Konstantin Slobodanyuk.
Когда было полностью институтом расследовано, откуда берутся прогнозы Министерства здравоохранения, оказалось, что это всего лишь маленькая часть прогноза Нила Фергюса.
So there was a huge investigation at the institute led by Dr. Oleg Maltsev and implemented by Konstantin Slobodanyuk, and it was about investigating the statistics that are basically influencing the choices that governments make, especially in the UK and European Union. And it all turned out the statistics was almost made up by Ferguson team, not almost, but made up.
Но когда эта статья была опубликована, какая истерика началась у очень многих людей.
But when that article by Konstantina was published, which basically revealed the factual state of affairs, people started being in hysteria because of that.
И мне показалось, что это не один тест, а множество тестов на устойчивость психики людей, на способности адекватно мыслить во время пандемии.
And it seemed to me that this is not one test. There are different tests that are testing our stress resilience, our psychological capacity, our capacity of thinking adequately.
И я тоже не сторонник конспирологических теорий, как и Стив Бест, и Люсьен Аллах-Биб. Одновременно мы видели, что те, кто может получить пользу от ситуации пандемии, обладают властью.
And I'm also not a supporter of conspirology theories as Dr. Best, as Lucien, and as other colleagues of our panel. So I do believe that there are certain structures that do have power and influence.
Поэтому мне нравится выражение братьев Стругацких, что часто человечество будет разделено по неизвестному признаку. И вот этот неизвестный признак, может быть, и пандемия есть.
I do like an expression which was termed by brothers Strugatsky, the writers that lived during the USSR period. They said that the population is going to be divided frequently by different peculiar characteristics. And I think, in my personal viewpoint, that this pandemic is also this peculiar division of people.
Как ни странно, по отношению к пандемии многие думающие люди оказались ковид-диссидентами.
And it is interesting that a lot of people, in relation to pandemic, they took the position when they're COVID dissidents.
И наоборот, очень много людей стали делать мифологические ритуальные практики в поддержание своей веры в пандемию.
And some people started implementing their mythological ritual practices to support this pandemic.
Я сейчас не говорю о врачах, которые боролись с реальной угрозой. И я не говорю о волонтерах, которые помогали конкретным людям. Я сейчас говорю об информационной истерии.
And I'm not speaking about the doctors that were really fighting with the real threat. I'm not speaking about volunteers that did actually help. I'm speaking about information spread, basically disinformation of people.
Одновременно вот проводя очень много занятий со своими студентами онлайн, можно отметить тенденцию, что практически многие студенты оказались в свободном времени онлайн и довольны онлайн обучением, хотя им не хватает личного общения.
And since I conduct a lot of online classes with my students, I should mention that most of them are fine and happy with online education, even though they maybe miss a little bit of personal communication.
Поэтому, если подытожить те тенденции, которые связаны с тестом или проектом, мы можем говорить о результате происходящих событий.
So if to conclude the tendencies that are related to the project or the test in the form of pandemics, then we just look at the results, at the consequences of what is happening.
Это способность навязать волю информационной симуляцией.
And the result, the consequences of this pandemic is that it showed that people are vulnerable to the information, to the disinformation.
Серьезная виртуализация обучения.
And that education is becoming more and more virtual.
И третье – это наличие серьезнейших потерь в экономике среднего класса и получение прибыли людьми, которые оказались в тени.
And the third point is the serious problem in middle class when it comes to finances.
Вот, пожалуй, в этих моментах я и вижу все-таки какую-то и проективную часть события, которое произошло.
So in this points, I do see the project part of this pandemic in relation to what has happened.
И одновременно я вижу определенные вызовы для научного осмысления этих процессов.
At the same time, I see that science now is challenged to reconsider these things.
Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lipsky, and I give the floor to Professor Vitaly Lunev.
Спасибо. То, что происходит сейчас, в моем представлении, по последствиям сопоставимо, ну, как если бы с очередной мировой войной по масштабу того, что задействованы страны, ресурсы, судьбы людей, судьбы огромнейших систем. Поэтому, естественно, это все выглядит как довольно-таки серьезный проект, тестирующий готовность его повторять еще какое-то количество раз в будущем.
So due to the consequences that we see currently in the world, I think that it resembles very much as if there was a world war. Keeping in mind the fates of so many people that were affected, keeping in mind the resources that were used and still are being used, and many other things. So coming from these things, it seems that it is a project which is testing the humanity as to how many times it may be repeated. How many times this type of pandemics may be repeated?
И это неизбежная сторона, обратная сторона глобализации, когда, по сути своей, в мире можно создать любую ситуацию, потому что весь этот мир, ну, на самом деле состоит из различных симулякр, из того, что не существует, но что можно регулярно копировать, раздувать, увеличивать. И поэтому ответить на вопрос, что было в самом начале, ну, практически невозможно.
And I believe that this is the opposite side of globalization, since, I mean, every situation or every entity that exists in the world, almost all of them are simulacra type, and anything that doesn't exist might be copied, duplicated, expanded, and etc.
И то, что сейчас должно и может быть объектом нашего внимания, можно назвать как вторичной выгодой от того, что происходит. Вот как в глубинной психологии мы говорим о вторичной выгоде от симптома, так и в этой ситуации, что есть в нынешнем мире, вторичная выгода от происходящего, по сути своей, рассказывает об очень многом.
So what should be the subject of our attention is the secondary advantage of what is happening. Just like in psychology, we have the secondary advantage of the system.
Что очень важно, обнажилось, собственно, табу. Вот если мы берем, к примеру, дружбу или дружеские отношения, мы знаем, что в этих отношениях есть табу на предательство. Если мы говорим о семье, речь идет о табу на измену. Если мы говорим о каком-то политическом союзе, то идет табу на распад этого союза. И вот как раз случилось наоборот. Случилось то, что все, что было табуированным, вдруг вырвалось, собственно, на поверхность. Вот такова сегодняшняя картина многих политических союзов.
And what is important, I think that this situation, the pandemic, had basically revealed and unloosened the taboo things. For instance, if we speak about friendship, it is considered to be unacceptable to betray your friend. Or if it's a family, you cannot be unfaithful. Or if it's a political union, you have to be always true to your principles and be together. And I think that what is happening right now is the completely opposite thing of what was considered to be taboo. It became naked.
Вот почему политические лидеры Европы стали откровенно националистичными. То, что в Европейском Союзе табуировалось долгие годы, в настоящее время воспринимается как нечто нормальное. И я это связываю с теорией Филиппа Раштона, теорией генетического подобия, которая как раз и подразумевает, что такой тип поведения в условиях угрозы, он, собственно, является примитивным, но самым, что не есть, однозначно проявляющимся.
So why political leaders of European Union did frankly become nationalistic? So for instance, for many years, it was a taboo thing for Europe to be as so. So now it became normal, and everybody is just conceiving it as normal. So what comes to my mind is the theory of Philip Rushton, which was about genetic alikeness. So it is a very primitive level, but it is something that is manifested altogether.
Это простой ответ на вопрос свой-чужой. И после этого, когда ответ находится, кто есть свой, кто есть чужой, перед этим человеком или открываются границы, или они закрываются. Примитивно до ужаса, но от этого рушится вся система, которую идеализировали особенно которую идеализировали у нас в Украине по поводу Европы?
So this is my simple answer to the question, because currently things are wildly primitive, because people are divided to we and they. For instance, people that are not like ours or they are not like us, they are prohibited to enter the country, and people that so it is very primitive level, and the system, the European system, which was idealized especially by Ukraine, now has completely collapsed.
И последний важный момент, на который я бы хотел обратить внимание, то, что в мире, который мы сейчас называем эпохой постмодернизма или мир, построенный на симуляциях, есть одна очень важная особенность. Наша эпоха – это время, когда индивид не способен остановиться. Вот почему вот я уверен, что то, что происходит сейчас, не остановится. Дальше будет приобретать какие-то новые формы. Мир в этом отношении становится другим. Спасибо.
So last important point that I would like to mention is that as it is termed that we are living in the postmodernism world, or in the world which is founded on simulation, I do believe that one peculiar thing about this world is that an individual just cannot stop. And I believe that the situation that we are in right now is not going to stop. It is going to continue, but in different forms.
Thank you, Professor Luniov. And Alexander Sagaidak, you can continue this discussion, please.
Спасибо. Итак, я хотел бы в своем выступлении подхватить мысль, которую высказал профессор Лепский.
So I would like to express my own opinion to what has been said by Professor Lepsky.
Вот этот его замечательный пассаж о том, что множество людей совершало некие ритуальные действия, как бы, даже не то, что, как бы это сказать, но как заклинания какие-то пандемии, по-другому не скажешь.
So I would like to comment his point when he said that people are performing ritualistic or mythological actions. So I cannot term but to say that this is kind of voodoo pandemic. People are creating this pandemic into something like a ritual.
Как будто бы пандемия — это некое божество, которому нужно выразить поклонение и тем самым задобрить его.
So it's figuratively speaking, it's as if the pandemic is a certain goddess or god that should be pestered and people are trying to make it kind.
И на самом деле это действительно так на психологическом уровне.
And in fact, on psychological level, that is true.
Потому что мы прекрасно знаем о существовании архетипических сценариев.
For the reason that we all know that we have archetypological scenarios in our memory.
И о таком архетипическом сценарии, как чума.
And when we remember such an archetypal scenario as a plague.
И когда мы говорим о чуме как об архетипическом сценарии, то здесь речь идет не о самой этой инфекционной болезни. На уровне архетипических символов чума — это любая пандемия.
And when we speak about this archetypological scenario of a plague, we do not speak about infection as such. However, on the psychological level, on this archetypological scenario environment, any type of pandemic is a plague.
И что мы знаем об этом архетипическом сценарии?
So what do we know about this scenario?
Что биологическое заражение обязательно сопровождается психическим заражением.
We know that biological infection always has a follow-up of psychological problem.
Причем психическое заражение опережает биологическое по скорости и превосходит его по масштабу.
Meanwhile, psychological infection, it is much more faster than biological infection, and its scale and impact is even higher.
Те самые механизмы психического заражения, которые еще в XIX веке исследовали Тарт, Лебон, Сигеле,
And those mechanisms of psychological infection that were studied in 19th century by Tartt, Libon, and one more person.
Сигеле.
Сигеле.
Мы наблюдаем их в наше время во всей, что называется, мощи.
We observe these mechanisms that were studied in 19th century right now, and very vividly.
И вот те древние архетипические, действительно ритуально-магические механизмы,
and those archetypological mechanisms that are in fact ritual and magical mechanisms,
вот эти вот иррациональные действия, вызванные массовой паникой,
those irrational acts that were triggered by massive panic,
они в информационном пространстве, особенно в интернете, продолжаются до сих пор.
They still continue in the information space and especially in the internet.
Психическое заражение – это очень эффективный ресурс влияния на общество.
And a psychological contagion is a very effective tool to influence masses.
На технологическом уровне это было апробировано еще во времена Французской революции.
On the technological level, this mechanism was already approbated during French Revolution.
В 20 веке эти технологии развили, буквально до очень серьезного уровня.
And in the 20th century, these technologies did develop even more.
Но одновременно история 20 века показала, насколько это опасный политический, так сказать, механизм.
However, the experience and the events of 20th century, they demonstrated us that this mechanism is a very powerful and very politically dangerous tool.
Например, Карл Густав Юнг в 1936 году опубликовал статью «Вот он».
For instance, Carl Gustav Jung did publish an article in Autumn publication in 1936.
И в этой статье он предупреждал об опасности того психического заражения.
And in that article, he cautioned people against this psychological infection,
с которым играли тогдашние лидеры Германии.
And that infection was in the game, in the hands of the leaders of Europe that were playing with the psychological contagion.
Архетипическая энергия на уровне массовой психологии
Archetypological energy on the level of massive psychology
легко может выйти из-под контроля.
Can easily become out of the control.
И развиваться по своим закономерностям, которые трудно предсказать.
And start developing by its own rules that are very hard to predict.
Поэтому, если то, что происходит сейчас с пандемией коронавируса, это чей-то проект,
For this reason, if what is going on right now with the pandemics, if this is somebody's project,
то это весьма рискованный проект.
then it is a very risky project.
И результаты этого проекта могут весьма неприятно удивить его организаторов.
And the results of the project might be negatively surprising for the organizers.
Из опыта эпидемий прошлого
Coming from the experience of other epidemics in the past,
особенно великая пандемия чумы XIV века,
particularly the very extensive pandemic of plague in 14th century,
мы знаем, что такое колоссальное психическое потрясение обязательно приводит к децентрализации.
We do know that such a massive psychological impact always leads to decentralization.
Ослабевают механизмы общественной интеграции,
Social integration mechanisms become very loose,
и люди тяготеют к таким узкокорпоративным формам выживания.
and people start tending to a very narrow corporate ways of survival.
Please sum up in 1 minute.
Поэтому нам, специалистам в области психологии и индивидуальной, и общественной,
For this reason, we as specialists in the psychology, in the mass psychology and individual one,
нужно быть особенно внимательными к тому, что происходит,
we should be very attentive to what is happening right now,
потому что мы отдаем себе отчет в том, какими непредсказуемыми могут быть последствия.
because we do understand that the consequences might be unforeseeable and we never know what might happen.
Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, dear colleagues. And the final third topic of our discussion is ancient Jewish conflict as a prime example from any textbook on strategic governance. And I give the floor to Dr. Maltsev.
Спасибо, что дали слово.
Thank you for giving me the floor.
И я вам хочу рассказать историю.
And I would like to start with a story.
У нас в Одессе был такой случай.
We once had an incident in Odessa.
Одному не совсем нормальному человеку
Not very psychologically healthy person
сказали, что если он купит документы, что он третий помощник на корабле,
he was told that if he buys documents that he is the third assistant on the ship,
то он может идти третьим помощником на корабль и там работать.
he believed that he would be capable of going to the ship and actually be the third assistant on the ship after the captain.
И он на это согласился.
So he agreed to buy the documents.
Заплатил какие-то умопомрачительные деньги.
And he paid like funny amounts of money
В надежде получить еще большую прибыль в будущем.
in the hope to get even more benefits in the future.
И пошел на корабль,
So he started his work at the ship.
который уходил в море на 6 месяцев.
And the ship would go to the sea for 6 months.
Как вы понимаете, его ссадили в следующем же ближайшем порту.
And logically, he was returned back to his house on the closest next port.
И капитан и все остальные были в глубочайшем шоке.
And the captain and the whole crew was really shocked.
Как ему это могло прийти в голову?
I mean, they were surprised at his idea.
Большинство психологов в мире постоянно декларируют о том, что по сути своей поведение человека иррационально.
So most of the psychologists around the world, they declare that the behavior of a person is irrational.
То есть, по сути, это проявление вот той самой ущербности.
And it is the manifestation of that very inferiority.
То есть, по сути своей, если мы вот, знаете, представим себе эту ущербность как некий механизм,
If we think of that inferiority as a certain mechanism,
то у нее огромное количество последствий.
it would have different kinds of consequences.
И очень многие как бы психологи считают причинами вот эти самые последствия, хотя на самом деле они причинами не являются, а являются лишь последствиями той самой ущербности.
And unfortunately, most of the psychologists, they consider the consequences to be the reasons, which is totally wrong. They are just consequences, and the reasons are different.
То есть только что мы видели вот этот яркий пример, когда человек взял на себя ответственность, не имея могущества.
And based on the story that I have explained about the person who bought the documents, we saw a vivid example how a person accepted responsibility without having the might and the skills and capacity to do that thing.
То же самое, когда мы говорим подчинение правилам, для этого должна быть норма. То есть человек должен быть нормальным, чтобы он подчинялся правилам.
And same thing applies when we speak about subordination to the rules. In order for a person to comply with the rules, there has to be a norm, and he should be capable of complying with them if he is healthy mentally.
Смотрите, он может не хотеть подчиняться правилам, но должен быть способен.
There might be cases when a person doesn't want to comply with the rules, but he is capable of doing that.
То есть, если человек не хочет подчиняться правилам, он говорит, я не хочу, и все.
And if a person doesn't want to comply with the rules, everything is very simple. He just says, I do not want.
Совершенно другая ситуация, когда он говорит, да, я буду подчиняться правилам.
And the bad situation is when a person says, yes, I will comply with the rules.
И при этом правилам не подчиняется.
And then later on, he doesn't keep his word.
И опять нарушается вот этот самый баланс.
And this balance, it gets disrupted again and again.
Давайте вспомним армию.
Let's remember about the army.
Там каждый человек, служащий в армии, подчиняется уставу.
As we all know, in the person, every individual there, he complies with the decree which is written.
При этом эти люди не сумасшедшие.
And at the same time, people that are in the army are not insane.
Такие не ущербные.
They are not inferior.
То есть эти люди как бы выполняют задачи, которые перед ними ставит командование, и успешно с этим справляются.
They are the people that implement tasks that are set by the commanding body, and they fulfill them.
То есть быть способным подчиняться не значит быть ущербным.
The capability to basically follow the rules and implement the commands doesn't mean that you are inferior.
Классической формой последствий ущербности является беспомощность.
And the classical form of the consequences of the inferiority of human being is helplessness, weakness.
Приобретает некие гипертрофированные формы в нашем обществе.
And in the society, in the masses, this incapacity or inability, it takes different extreme forms.
И когда мы как бы считаем, что за нас все должно сделать правительство,
and when people think that the government has to take responsibility and it has to do everything for people,
нам нужно вспомнить, что правительство — это такие же точно люди, как и все остальные.
We should always remember that the government, people in the government, are just regular people, just like we are.
И вот так возникает крах.
And this is how the chaos and failure comes in.
То есть, когда вы выбирали этого президента, этого канцлера, эти правительства, вы, наверное, не предполагали, что они не способны управлять.
So when people were electing the chancellor or the government or whoever, probably people were not even thinking that they are incapable of managing the country.
Обратите внимание, никогда не бывает так, чтобы президент пришел к власти и он оправдал надежды общества.
Pay attention that it never happens that the president comes to power and he justifies, he fulfills all the expectations of people. Never happens.
Обманутые ожидания.
It is always about disappointment and people regretting about the choices they made.
А это как раз ответственность без могущества.
And that would fall into category of accepting responsibility to do something without being capable to fulfill that.
То есть наш симулятивный мир, наше общество потребления выработало некое правило, и считает это нормальным, что к власти может прийти человек, который ни на что не способен.
So this consumer society and the simulated world have generated a certain rule that says that it is okay to elect a president or somebody in the power who is incapable of performing his duties.
И когда профессор Лепский говорит о том, против чего они протестуют,
And then Professor Levsky says what they are revolting against.
они возмущены обманутыми ожиданиями своими.
Here's the answer to Professor Levsky. People are disappointed with the choices they made. They regret.
И когда профессор Сагайдак говорит о вот этой психическом, инфицировании, то я хочу напомнить еще наш корифей психиатрии,
Бехтерев.
Профессор Бехтерев посвятил этому огромное количество статей и исследований.
And so when Professor Sagaidak is speaking about psychological contagion, we have to remember that our professor, the Bechterев, just a bright scientist, he dedicated all of his life to the investigation of this phenomena.
И если бы не читали тех авторов, которых описал Александр Николаевич,
And if people had read those authors that were mentioned by Professor Sagaidak,
то уж мы своих соотечественников мы должны были читать.
Then if people didn't read those books, then we had to read at least the Bechterев, people that is our comrade. He's not alive now.
Подводя итог, можно сказать следующее.
To conclude, I would like to say the following.
То есть вот эта самая ущербность, она по сути своей в человеке заложена и биологически, и антропологически, и на всех психологически, и на всех других уровнях.
It should be mentioned that inferiority as such is already, we have it on biological level, on all levels of psychology, and on anthropological level as well.
И разрешить это уравнение, решить эту формулу в себе, это значит и есть стать человеком.
And to resolve this conflict, resolve this formula in oneself personally, it means to become a human being in the real sense of this word.
Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Maltsev. And the discussion can be continued by Professor Olagbib.
Thank you to give me the floor. And I began first by saying the medical political power and now don't like the liberty. Doesn't like the liberty, and for instance, if you take an interaction between liberty and responsibility, we lost this capacity of interaction between liberty and responsibility now. For instance, in France, our doctors don't have the possibility to give their own treatment. It's not possible, it's forbidden. The state decides what kind of medicament treatment is possible or not. And it's why also you have, for instance, another. You have the problem of the mask in France. During 2 months, the leader said to us, it's not necessary. In the peak of the pandemic, they said it's not necessary. And now it's necessary. And the wave of the pandemic is now down. as our specialist said, like Didier Raoult in Marseille, the pandemic is finished. Even in USA, it's finished because the numbers are very combined with all kinds of ills. If you have an accident of car, and if you tested positive, you dead by COVID-19 and not by the accident. It's very political, this kind of thing. It's why I suppose that now the responsibility is in the pattern of in global infantilization of citizens. The responsibility is down now, and the liberty also. You can, like in China, for instance, you can consume anything. You can become rich if you want or not. But if you want to become not just a subject but an actor, it's very difficult. It's why, for instance, again in France, we have a law, a new law, the Avia law. Avia law is to discipline the internet, the network, the social network, because the social network become a counterpower. For instance, now the medias, all the medias, become a transmission, just a power official of propaganda, and is not a counter power. All the media in the Occidental world, but even in the other country, I don't know what is the problem in UK now, but in France, in USA, in UK, all the media are organized to transmit the official position of the government. It's why the confidence of the people about the democracy and about the system is very difficult now. And if you want the citizen follow the rules, it's necessary to be confident about the organization, about the rules, and the rules will be legitimate by the very rational analysis, and it's not the case. And I suppose now it's very complicated because we are going in a soft totalitarianism, if you want. Yes, it's hyperrealism in the totalitarianism way, because it's very difficult to have another position. If you have another position like official position, and official position is not the government only, it's also all what is the term, the ancient rebellion, if you want. It's necessary maybe to make a historic analysis, but for instance, the left tendency become an official current of the government now. They are very agreed that we are in the collapse edge. It's necessary to reframe the liberty and to control the liberty. All the political elite didn't like the people liberty. They just it's necessary to consume if you want, but if you want to criticize the way of life like is decided by our leaders, it becomes very difficult to because all the ancient forces are collapsed now or are integrated in the state of the political power. For instance, in France, the leftists, the extreme leftists, and even the extreme right are agree to reinforce the medieval political power. It's very difficult, but it's possible if you are just few to resist and to have to become resilient against that. And it's possible also the people were not very confident about the official truth. Maybe reverse his position and traverse and become I don't explain, and maybe to accept a new consideration, if you want.
Please summarize in 1 minute.
And in conclusion, I said the fatality is not only horizon, if you want. It's possible if you are able to seduce the people, the young people, and other forces, new forces inside the network, social network, it's possible to reverse the situation.
Thank you. Thank you. And please I give the floor to Dr. Stephen Best. Yes, please turn on the sound.
There we go. Sorry, my cat got on the keyboard. Okay, so there is not necessarily any conflict between rules and responsibilities. This conflict will arise only when the rule is morally or legally wrong. And in fact, if we look at the spheres in society of law and morality, we see something like a Venn diagram. Right? There's the legal, there's the ethical, and sometimes they overlap, but not always. So this is why we have the phenomenon of civil disobedience. People are told to obey a rule that they think is morally wrong. So they feel their responsibility is no longer to obey that rule, but to disobey the rule. Put it another way, when the law is wrong, the right thing to do is break it. And so we have a long and rich history here in the United States of civil disobedience. people voting on their conscience rather than listening to authority about what is right to resist various forms of oppression, and thereby moving forward moral evolution and democratic advances in society. If the rule is a rational and ethical rule rather than an irrational, unethical rule, I think we have a responsibility to obey it. For instance, do not kill is a legal prescript, a moral prescript that seems rational and ethical to me, unless there's very specific examples of how we should kill. One ought not to kill. Okay, so here in the U.S. right now, people are widely disobeying rules to, for instance, social distance or to wear a mask. These again are the malcontents of society that are Trump supporters and tend not to believe in the science of pandemics and just feel only that their freedom is being inhibited. One of their slogans is social distancing equals socialism. And this shows you that a few differences are being conflated here. In some cases, states overreach their authority and require citizens to confine themselves, say from beaches or something, when possibly the science says it's safe. But we have the general phenomenon right now where people are required to wear a mask in public, and many people are refusing to wear this mask. I feel like we have a responsibility to follow this particular rule. And the reason why I feel this way is it's not a personal choice when you're in a public space and there is a pandemic. The very sphere realm of ethics, as we define it, is it's an intersubjective field. We do what we want to do when we want to do it, if and when that action does not harm any other living being, and that would include animals in that definition. And when it does, we ought not to do it. So there's a wide range of freedoms that we have, except when they infringe on the freedom or health of other people. So this isn't, unless you believe that the pandemic is grossly exaggerated, let's assume it's real and that these are real dangers in public spaces, we have an obligation to follow these rules. As scientists and medical experts suggest, we ought to wear a mask. So when people are taking off their masks or refusing to go in the stores with the mask and they're being turned away from stores, I think these are valid choices by the store owners to keep these people out. Because again, it's not a personal choice when someone is in a public sphere where they could harm others. And they may feel invulnerable, but other people are not. So it is a matter, not a personal choice, but of public health. So this is an example where we have a responsibility to follow rules when these rules are rational and ethical. In many cases, they may not be either.
That's all. Thank you, Student Best. And I give the floor to Professor Maxim Lepsky, please.
Спасибо за возможность включиться в дискуссию. Мне бы хотелось вернуться к некоторым моментам, которые обсудили с доктором Мальцевым по поводу вот этой триады ущербность, норма, могущество. Вот если мы посмотрим на вот эту тему конфликта, как из учебника стратегического управления, то одним из существенных проявлений, я сделаю паузу, чтобы перевели.
Нет, пожалуйста, продолжайте.
То здесь ключевыми проблемами появляется первая проблема. Это безответственное могущество или попытка к нему прийти правителей, которые сейчас находятся у власти. Это, с другой стороны, ущербные правила или ненормальность. И, с другой стороны, это симуляционное ущербность, пытающаяся пропагандой показать, что они что-то могут. И вот эти три вызова становятся очень серьезными для нынешней ситуации. И вот разрешение этой проблемы мне предполагается как раз и состоит в поиске научного ответа, почему мир меняется, о чем говорил доктор Лунев, как можно согласовать эти правила и ответственность, о чем абсолютно верно говорит Мальцев, доктор, и, очевидно, уход от неомифологизации, о которой говорил доктор Сагайдак.
So I would like to comment on the paradigm which was presented by Dr. Maltsev when he mentioned about inferiority, capacity, and the rules. So I would like to take the three things and take a look what is wrong with the management of power right now. And I think that the key problems are as follows. So we have, for instance, irresponsible power. I mean, basically leaders that are irresponsibly using their capacities, or we have inferior rules. The rules themselves are not fine. And also, since I mean, some people are trying to propagate with this inferior rules as if they can do something. And I think that these are challenges for our current situation. And I do agree with Professor Lunev on when he spoke about what has to be done in the world. And I do agree with Dr. Matze when he spoke about responsibility and its relation to the rules, and that we have to distray, we have to go away from neo-mythologization as mentioned by Professor Sagaidak.
И второй момент, который хотелось бы отметить, это что именно эти деформации обычно ведут к тоталитаризму и к тем дисциплинарным практикам, о которых писал Мишель Фуко.
And I think that these deformations, they lead to totalitarianism, as was written by Michel Foucault.
Одновременно мы видим, что именно это серьезнейшая основа разрушающей гиперреальности.
And at the same time, we see that this is a very serious ground that crushes and destroys hyperreality.
Ну и поскольку это последний круг обсуждения, мне хотелось бы поблагодарить коллег, что они обогатили смыслами ту проблематику, которая была поставлена, и теперь есть о чем подумать на досуге и пофилософствовать.
And since this is the last circle of our discussion, I would like to thank all of the colleagues that are participating today in this panel. And I would like to thank them for bringing the meaning to different problematics that do exist right now. So this is certainly a food for thought during the leisure time, things that I can take and look at them from philosophical perspective as well.
И спасибо за тяжелую работу переводчикам. Переводить то, что мы говорим, это очень большое искусство.
And thank you for the translator to translate this kind of things. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lepsky. And I give the floor to Professor Vitaly Lunev.
Большое спасибо. Когда я готовился к этому вопросу, я понял, что это не очень мой вопрос с точки зрения знания истории древнего Израиля и конфликтов, которые, собственно, эту историю составляют. Но я нашел для себя возможным такой вот эпизод, который, как мне кажется, лежит в основе появления израильского народа как такового, конфликт, который лежит в основе его появления.
Thank you very much for giving me the word. While I was preparing for this panel discussion, I understood that these questions are not my specialty for the reason that I'm not knowledgeable in the history of ancient Israel and the conflict that was in the history of this nation. However, while we were speaking, I think there is certain episode which brightly demonstrates this, because if we remember how the Israeli nation was forming, we know that in the basis of their formation was the conflict.
Да, это с точки зрения библейской истории конфликт выхода из Египта, египетского рабства. И этому соответствовало несколько событий. Защита народа Израиля от ангела смерти, который должен был пройтись по народу. И вот только те, кто слушался рекомендаций, пожеланий и правил, данных Моисеем, остались живыми. Им нужно было вот банально оставаться дома, не выходить в ту зловещую ночь, когда это случилось. И таким образом народ оказался спасенный, ну а дальше историю вы знаете. Вот в этом сюжете я обнаружил сходство, собственно, с историей христианства на будущее, о том, как всегда народ был спасаемый, только лишь благодаря тому, что он изолировался, прятался, сидел, ждал, и вот в этот момент происходили какие-то события, которые его не касались, а он оставался в живых. Вот в этом я обнаружил для себя, по сути, такую, что ли, архетипичную картину, которая после повторяется в ряде современных событий.
So this conflict is a biblical one. If you remember, it was about Israeli people coming from Egypt, being freed from their slavery, and there were different events, and Israeli people, they had to be protected from the angel of death. And so the Moses, the prophet, he said, if you're going to listen to me, you are going to be safe. So here's my decree. You have to be isolated. You have to sit at home and you will be safe. And as the story goes, as you all know, the Israeli people, they did listen to the Moses and they were at their houses and the nation was saved as such, according to the biblical story. So this episode in the history, it also reminds me of the history of Christianity in the future. And this that episode is very archetypological with what is happening right now. Basically, every nation in the biblical sense, it was saved, it was protected from different evils or different threats by being in isolation, sitting at home, protecting itself, hiding, and then there would be different events that would be unfolding that would have allowed them to survive. So this is for me a certain archetypological chain.
И, как мне кажется, собственно, люди или человечество вот примерно этого и ожидают. Ведь, условно, на нашей первой панельной дискуссии, когда мы говорили о религиях, я вспомнил массу эпизодов, когда в основе появления нового святого или какого-то ответвления того же христианства было чудо остановления смертельной болезни, там, какой-то чумы или чего угодно. Это то, что по-прежнему остается в ожиданиях людей. Так вот, из этой картинки, из этого эпизода я вижу как то, что на самом деле большая часть человечества, она нуждается в такой изолятивный способ переходить от одной эпохи к другой. И, к сожалению, это та стратегия, на которую человечество соглашается. Спасибо.
And as it seems to me, humanity currently, it is expecting this type of miracle to happen. And the first discussion online panel was dedicated to the new dogmas of the new era. Basically, the topic was religion and spirituality. So, and I remembered a lot of episodes, the way new saints or new prophets did emerge in the history, or new denominations of Christianity, the way they emerged in the history, that people always waited for some kind of miracle to happen, and it did happen for them. And I think that currently whole humanity right now, it is expecting something like this to happen because they are isolating. And unfortunately, this type of the strategy is what is accepted by this humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lunyov. And the final speech on this panel discussion, please, Alexander Sagaidak.
Спасибо. Во-первых, хочу выразить восхищение тому содокладчику, который помогал профессору Бесту. Код – это лучший собеседник для ученого.
First of all, I would like to appreciate the assistant of Dr. Best who was preparing him and making the speech, because the cat is the best companion of a scientist.
И если говорить о вот этой вот теме, которую мы сейчас рассматриваем, то снова-таки, если мы обратимся к опыту прошлого, если мы обратимся к содержанию архетипических сценариев, связанных с чумой, то мы увидим, что вот эта вот децентрализация, она неизбежно приводила к такому явлению, которое Эмиль Дюркгейм назвал аномия.
And speaking about the subject that we were discussing, then if we take a look at the different archetypological scenarios related with the plague, we would see that decentralization, which is inevitable, and Emil Durkheim did describe this as anemia.
Что такое аномия? В сущности, это снижение силы влияния социальных норм и социальных функций.
And what is anemia in the sense that was termed by Emil Durkheim is the decrease of influence and power of sociological and other governmental influences.
Мы знаем, что закон, норма – это прежде всего коллективный психологический навык.
We do know that the law and the norm in the first place is a collective psychological skill.
И сила, и, собственно говоря, сама реальность действия любого закона связана с тем, насколько глубоко он укоренен в коллективной психике.
And the power and the realism of any law depends on how well it is integrated in the collective psychology.
И, как снова-таки говорил Эмиль Дюркгейм, в состоянии аномии те социальные институты, которые продуцировали социальные нормы, они просто уже не справляются с этой задачей.
And again, to quote, to refer to the thoughts of Emil Durkheim, when he spoke about anemia, is that social institutions that produce social norms are not capable of governing and leading these norms.
Но природа не терпит пустоты, социальная природа в том числе, и если нормы не продуцируются центральными институтами общества, они начинают продуцироваться более локальными.
But the nature doesn't tolerate any gaps. And so if the central institutions, if they do not produce certain norms, then these norms will start being produced by local institutions.
То есть по-любому начинают усиливаться какие-то локальные корпоративистские тенденции.
So in any way, we will see the acceleration of local and corporate institutions norms.
Сейчас мы особенно явно это наблюдаем в нашей стране, где регионы и даже отдельные города уже начинают вести свою, так сказать, политику и даже что-то вроде своего законодательства в вопросах, как вести себя во время пандемии.
And this is very evident in the country where I live, in Ukraine, because certain regions, certain cities they are already forming their kind of politics, even the legitimate way of how people should behave during the pandemic, their own laws, basically.
И, разумеется, в этом нет ничего удивительного, потому что люди верят тому, кто готов взять на себя ответственность.
And certainly, there's nothing surprising in this, because people do believe in ones that are ready to accept responsibility.
И, как совершенно справедливо отметил профессор Мальцев, то, что мы сейчас наблюдаем, это зрелище грустное, прежде всего потому, что аномия охватила не только широкие народные массы, но и верхи, элиту.
And I totally agree with Dr. Maltsev when he says that the situation which is happening right now is very, very disappointing, because this anemia, it captured not only white audiences and the population, but it also infiltrated into the elite, into the power, which has to be wise and which supposedly has to guide people.
Обратите внимание, что такой социальный институт, как наука, в происходящих условиях тоже не демонстрирует особого единства.
And please pay attention that such a social institute as science doesn't demonstrate unity in this case.
Между тем, именно к авторитету науки люди готовы прислушиваться. И именно...
And at the same time, people are ready to listen to the authority of science.
И именно в ученых они готовы бы увидеть людей, которые могут взять на себя ответственность.
And they would be happy to see scientists as somebody that can take responsibility for them and show them the right way.
И смею надеяться, коллеги, что мы с вами относимся как раз к той категории ученых, которые готовы отвечать желаниям народных масс.
And I dare to hope that we colleagues that are in this online discussion panels are those scientists that can accept responsibilities and are the ones that can justify the hopes of the masses.
Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you for attention.
So let me thank all speakers, dear colleagues and experts. Overall, it's high time we have finished the online panel. Soon after, the conference organizational matters, such as text reports, video reports, and the online discussion panels will be published on the conference website on May 22nd. Furthermore, a conference collection volume will be published within 2 weeks period, and that brochure will be available to those who are interested. By this, thank you so much for your kind attention and participation, and see you soon.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.